2
le ngathi
i-1 kuphi phezulu lephansi
u-1 phansi
Check 1, 2.
Testing 1, 2.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon. I hope everyone is rested and has had a good lunch and got some blood and their blood sugar up before we start our next session. My apologies for beginning this a little bit late, but let's get into it. Our panel today is about big infrastructure wins. On our panel is Ms. Brenda Baijnath from Sasol, Mr. Lionel October from the IDC, and Mr. Jacques Kosef, who's a special advisor to the MEC in Economic Development. Thanks all so much for your time. Perhaps I'll start with you, Jacques. This forum is meant to help the government to identify regulatory impediments before final and costly decisions are made. How is that going to assist with big infrastructure wins?
And really, we always argue that there's about 4 big things the government can do. It can convene the space in the market, reduce information asymmetry, introduce funders to projects, and a lot of what the historic summits the government has tried to pull together have done that. But where we go forward with something like the SID Summit is the other 3, where government can co-invest. So through things like our Special Economic Zone Network, which was highlighted by Dr. Ramakgopa, we can literally be part of the commercial investment space in the context of large investments. We can create catalytic infrastructure in the context of things that are necessary for big investments and to basically happen from the point of view of roads, electricity systems or energy systems, water systems, the availability of ports and rail. And then we can really look at all the regulatory enabling that goes with all of that to unlock large-scale infrastructure-driven growth. I think that what the power with something like the SID Summit is it directly ties, in many cases, the objectives of government to the objectives of various kinds of private sector funders, and starts to really ask tough questions about what kinds of revenue streams can you collateralize, for example, in the financing of large-scale infrastructure to allow it to happen. And really, if you look at, I'll give 2 examples from projects I'm directly involved in, both from the Gauteng side and from the presidency side. You look at a project like the Lanseria Smart City, where the government decision that's needed if you want to unlock what we now know is about an 85 billion rand, known pipeline of developments, and potentially much more than that, creating about 30,000 developable hectares of really dense urban node in the northwest of Gauteng. To do that, government needs to put down 15 billion rand in public sector investment in the form of energy systems, water systems, sewage management, roads, digital, etc. So to get the public sector to that decision using ordinary mechanisms would take you the better part of 15, 20 years. It sits at the urban edge of 4 different municipalities. The fiscus doesn't have that kind of money at once. Yet by creating space through this kind of process to basically bring together not only the different kinds of government players, but also the different kinds of funders, we've actually used the discipline of the Infrastructure and Investment Office in the Presidency and the processes of the SID Summit to profile Lanseria as an investable special purpose vehicle, where we can create that kind of space.
Oh, thank you. Mr. October, we've heard Jacques speak.
Exports both for our agricultural products, but most importantly for our manufactured products. So it's opening up a massive market for us. So in terms of our special economic zones, which we, as you know, currently in our 6 special economic zones, like Kucha, the one next to King Shaka Airport, Dubai, Tradeport, Richards Bay, IDZ, the one in East London next to the Mercedes-Benz plant, those already currently the operational investors, we've managed to attract 150 investors into those zones. So they are fully operational. We are busy with 4 new special economic zones, and these are where the big opportunities are. So 2 of those special economic zones, the one is close to Beitbridge in Mosina. So that opens up the corridor and the gateway to the continent, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Kenya, right up. So we're creating a special economic zone in Mosina. It is busy now. They've issued the basic tenders now for the engineering work to be done. So that should become operational in next year, in 2022. That opens up that gateway for our exports onto the continent. The other big special economic zone that we're working on is in Komazi, which is right on the Lubombo border post with Mozambique. We are also currently working on one of the special economic zones. That serves, again, the gateway to Maputo port, and then from Maputo port to the rest of the continent for the exports of our citrus, agricultural products from Limpopo. And as you know, Limpopo is the bread basket of the country, so it's ideally located. And then, so that special economic zone will be mainly agro-processing and logistics, and then takes us via the sea, the Indian Ocean, to the continent. So those 2 special economic zones are really dedicated to the continental free trade area, and it has attracted some significant investors that are keen then to transport our goods and to create that logistical platform.
Brenda, this is a theme that you understand. We spoke about this a little bit earlier on the program, that Sasol is working in the Northern Cape, but is also somehow connected to Namibia. Talk to us more about that project and what you hope the big infrastructure wins will be at the end of it.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So we're very excited about Bukobai currently. So we see that as a significant export opportunity for the country. What's amazing for us is if you compare Bukobai to the likes of Chile, to the likes of Australia, it puts South Africa right up there in the map. It gives us the opportunity to reignite this economy and to really make us a global hydrogen player. So once it's fully developed, we expect that there would be almost 400,000 tons of green hydrogen that's being produced out of there, with 9 gigawatts of renewables. So this would be huge. We expect more than 6,000 new jobs to be created. So from a localization perspective, from a job creation perspective, this is a huge opportunity for the country. Now what's going to be important here is, and as you've heard yesterday, is that we have submitted an RFI, or RFP actually, for Namibia as well. We are seeing that there's a huge opportunity for both governments, both in Namibia and South Africa, to integrate and to be able to unlock synergies. And then if we have a regional play, we can really position the region as being a global hydrogen player. If you look at it from a geographical position, Bukobai is ideally positioned at the harbors. So we have port infrastructure. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of grid connectivity and investment that needs to be put in. But by bringing in the right investors, the right partners, we believe that this could be a landmark opportunity for the country. So very excited.
Okay, let's bring Stuart Theobald in. He's joining us from England. Stuart, a very good afternoon. I'm just checking that you can hear us before we proceed.
No.
Always good to do that. So let's come back into the room now. When it comes to infrastructure projects, there is obviously from outside investors a sense of risk, what they do want to get involved in, what they don't want to get involved in. From some reports, it appears that there is some hesitancy or reticence about the amount of risk in infrastructure projects in South Africa. Lionel, is that a correct perception?
Well, the big thing is the coordination problem. Because, as you know, from our side is to coordinate the public sector, the bulk infrastructure, government's infrastructure, the electricity, the water, the clearing of the site, the building of the factory shell, you know, purpose-built infrastructure. So there, the coordination is between the 3 tiers of government, because you need the national government, you need the provincial, and you need the metro or the municipality. And then it's to collaborate with the private sector. So our new model of special economic zone, which is in operation fully in the Swanny Automotive zone, we've solved that coordination problem. The SEZ is co-owned by the 3 tiers of government. So we've got 33% owned by Gauteng, 33% by DTIC, 33% owned by Swanny Metro. And then to get the collaboration right with the private sector, we also have 3 board seats, which is for Ford. And Ford, as you know, has made a 16 billion investment for their new Ford Ranger model. So we're building 12 factories, suppliers to Ford. And so this is the new special economic zone which Cabinet has adopted as a new model. So we solve the coordination problem of simultaneously rolling out purpose-built infrastructure for the private sector. So this zone is located right around the Ford plant. So they've made a 16 billion investment. Currently, we are completing the construction. The construction started about a year ago. It will be completed in February. So the model shows it has worked in practice. We managed to cut out all the red tapes. And the uncertainty issue has been resolved for Ford because they are sitting with us on the board. Jacques is also a member of the board. So we're on the board, and then we can coordinate according to when they roll out their new model, the new Ford Ranger in 2022. We'll have everything in place for them. And that is the new model for, as I said, it's coordination and collaboration with the private sector. So you solve the coordination by having all three tiers of government planning together, and then you have collaboration with the private sector.
All right, so part of the economic reconstruction and recovery plan is this aggressive drive for infrastructure investment.
Yes.
I want to stay with the issue of perception. We've heard about an example there where that gets eliminated, perceptions around perhaps not being able to coordinate properly are eliminated. How important is that issue of perception outside of the important things like policy and making sure that people come and see the opportunities for investment?
So I think a good example to see that through is a project that's linked to the Swanny Automotive Special Economic Zone, which is the Gauteng Eastern Cape High Capacity Rail Corridor. So in that particular case, you're dealing with the fact that South Africa is perceived as being a country that has not done well with regards to freight infrastructure. So if you look at the freight volumes over the last 2 decades, you've been losing to such an extent that about 80% of our freight now moves by road. So if you're an international investor that's looking at big logistics, you're looking at bringing components in, you're looking at manufacturing here and needing to get them out, as Ford is out of the special economic zone, part of your perception problem is that you think that we are not well supplied from a logistics perspective, that if you go through a port like Durban, you're going to face congestion. So it's important for us to do powerful demonstrative projects that show that we really do care about making the logistics system accessible to major investors. And that it's important for the government to do that in a way that also allows the private sector to feel like they've got some control over that process. So in the case of Gauteng Eastern Cape Corridor, as we presented to the SIDS platform yesterday, we're actually looking at third-party participation in both the management of the rail and the management of the wagons. So because that's the other problem that Lionel raised, that there's the risk that people see the dead hand of bureaucracy as basically curtailing or choking their value creation. And if we can really demonstrate that we're committed to creating that value, but then making sure that our social objectives are met in return for that value creation, we've got a deal we can make with the private sector. And their perception is quite critical.
Brenda, earlier on, there was talk of catalytic projects. I know that we've been spending a lot of time today on this particular hydrogen project of Sasol's, but you've announced that there's actually more to come. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we're looking broader into South Africa as well. So we want to position ourselves as being the first company to produce green hydrogen in 2023, and that's by using our existing assets in Sasolburg, which is in the Vaal area. So what we've seen is through some technical work is that by repurposing our existing advantaged assets, we're actually in a position to produce green hydrogen. We're doing it on a small scale, so 60 megawatts is what we're aiming to produce. That allows us to bring in partners to be able to learn, so that when we start to scale, we scale at pace because we're learning as we're doing. So that is going to be a huge milestone for us. So 2023 is something we're working towards. We have partnered with the IDC, and what they bring is not just funding, but they bring in intellect, they're bringing additional partners to help us to achieve that milestone. Second to that, we've also partnered in Qunta to be able to produce sustainable aviation fuels, and that we're doing in partnership with Linda, Enatrac, and So it's LEN Consortium. So it's Linda, Enetrac, and Navitas. So with those three partners, we are positioning to produce sustainable aviation fuels in the next 2 years. So we trying to start small to be able to test the facility, and hoping that in the next few years we can start to scale and make OR Tambo then, you know, the global airline hub for the fueling of sustainable aviation fuels. So those are the two projects that we are pursuing at scale as well.
All right. So before we continue, I'd like to say that if you have any questions from the floor, please raise your hand. I will keep on looking over to the audience. There will be a roving mic that I'm sure can be organized for any questions that you have, so you can raise your hand if you do have those. Let's stay with the issue of green energy. The IDC is aiming to convert a significant portion of a 24 billion rand investment pipeline into commitments. How much of that is going to green energy infrastructure?
So, as I said, the IDC has put aside now, just for current financial year, the 8 billion, right, which has been set aside for infrastructure. So, like this theme of this conference, one of the frontiers is the hydrogen green economy. So we, in a range of partnership, both to, there's, as was mentioned, there's Saldanha, which is a special economic zone as well. There's the Boegoebaai one. And then what was mentioned now, which will take off quite quickly, is the Vaal Special Economic Zone. Yeah. This is in your Sedibeng district.
The Vaal River Special Economic Zone.
Vaal River Special Economic Zone. And it's around our old industrial areas, like, you know, where ArcelorMittal is, your old Van der Bijl parks, and so on. So they, and as you know, people were speaking about green steel. You're going to face a tax to export to Europe if you do it from dirty energy. So there's also the pressure on the manufacturers to convert to hydrogen. So what you have is the perfect synergy now in the Vaal, where you've got your Sasols, you've got one or two other investors as well, which are going to be producing components for the electrolyzers and fuel cell components. So you've got the synergy in the Vaal Special Economic Zone, and the IDC is a big funder in those ones. As I said, because these ones are still in the, they've passed the pre-feasibility stage, we're actually going to be, within the Vaal, we hope to, in March next year, to break ground for the construction of the first factories.
First sites.
And then also to immediately bring some of the existing steel players onto the green hydrogen. And so on. So it's real, and it's similarly in Saldanha as well. As you know, there's an existing steel plant in Saldanha, which is mothballed at the present. That one will be coming back on stream. And then again, they can now move straight to hydrogen, to the green hydrogen, and not go through the green phase or the use natural gas.
Yeah.
They can go straight. So those are the exciting opportunities which the IDC is collaborating. And the big thing, as you mentioned about perceptions, I think if you, the great thing about, as I said, the current presidency is that I think that trust gap between private and public,
It's narrowing.
private and state sector is closing now. For the first time we see, I think, I mean, as I said, we've been in government for a long time. First time you can see we are now actually, from the conceptual stage already, we're starting to work together. You see Sasol here, you see some big investors, like we said, Ford, ArcelorMittal, and so on. Some of our old traditional players working now collaboratively in planning for this hydrogen economy. So it is really, I think it's going to be real. There's a real possibility. We do have established players. We do have the capital in the country. I think it's appropriately the right frontier that we can move into.
All right, we're speaking a lot about future kind of technologies, future plans when it comes to hydrogen, making South Africa a leader. Let's come back to the now, though. What's South Africa doing to ensure that the infrastructure that we have meets the needs of communities, especially in the context of the increase in extreme weather events and climate change and the like?
So I think this is a critical question, and a lot of what we are facing, which has historically just been thought of as municipal sphere responsibility, and full disclosure, I did work for one of our major metros for 9 years, so I've seen some of this firsthand. The truth is, you cannot anymore consider the infrastructure requirements of communities to be a single sphere of government or a limited municipality's responsibility. When you're looking at the extreme weather events, Our floods overwhelm our stormwater systems, our electricity systems are continually now being, the historical mode of delivery is insufficient for so many of the evolving and new kinds of urbanizing communities you deal with, especially in a province like Gauteng. So one of the things that was very refreshing for us to hear from CEO of Eskom yesterday, for example, is that they are very keen on expansion into technology such as microgrids, where you no longer rely on the old grid and its gradual kind of like ambling towards where new development has to happen. You install microgrids that can service where community density is happening right now. So if you look at, for example, the west of Gauteng, that's exactly what you need. You've got huge development that's opening up to the west of Soweto. You can't wait for the electricity to go there. You can install microgrids that get there faster. When you look at water systems, we've got to recognize that water could be our next crisis. So Gauteng, for example, just to focus there again for a moment, uses 4 to 6 times the amount of water per head that we should, if you compare us to other regions of similar sizes and densities globally. And a lot of that is down to the fact that we don't manage our current water infrastructure efficiently. About 35% of our water disappears through broken pipes and the like. So one of the things to think about is how we're going to finance that creatively. And this is the kind of thing that the SIDSSA Summit is going to have to confront in the next couple of years. With the new 100 megawatt cap, the one source of financing that municipalities used to use to cross-subsidize their infrastructure, which was large power users, is now going to disappear from the balance sheet. So now you're going to have to start thinking creatively. So for example, municipalities are probably going to have to start participating in vehicles created by forums such as this one that, for example, reimburse large water users from the rates perspective for fixing the water infrastructure that's underneath them and reducing the amount that's lost through leaks. This is the kind of logic that's going to have to apply, but municipalities aren't going to get there on their own. You're going to have to create innovative financing mechanisms, innovative policy mechanisms in government, and the role of Infrastructure South Africa, treating problems like this at a portfolio level, is going to be quite important going forward.
All right, we were talking earlier on today about the National Infrastructure Plan 2050. It recommends strengthening performance of state-owned enterprises, sector-specific regulations, and state capacity and private participation in public infrastructure delivery and management. If I listen to you, it sounds like we're already in 2050 when you give us the example of what happened with Ford. But is that really the case?
Well, as I said, I think we come from a background where the trust gap between business and government has been big, and so on. But I think the positive thing, over the past 2-3 years, that gap has now dramatically closed. And as I said, there are some real-life examples, not theoretically, but we've shown we can do it. I mean, Ford is one of the global giants, you know, and if Ford Motor Company makes a commitment of 16 billion rand, and they also say they're going to produce the next generation electric vehicles in South Africa. Then you know there's serious commitment from major players. So that's why I'm saying, I think both from the foreign investor perspective and our own giants and national champions like Sasol and your ArcelorMittals, that gap is now closing. The key thing, as you see, is now going to be for us to really have an effective state which can now build that infrastructure, as you say, brick by brick, rail by rail, because what we have failed in dismally as a country for the past 20 years, there's been almost zero investment in rail. Very, our as you say, electricity infrastructure is still not there, and so on. So we now have the appetite of the private sector. And it was released by SIDSSA yesterday. They're sitting on wild piles of money. They need to move to the concrete projects. As I said, this conference is ideally timed because we need to now revamp our infrastructure and we need to revamp our old industrial areas, and we can do it through decarbonization and so on. So I think we are well placed because we have the advantage of being an industrialized country already. So for us, it's reindustrialization. Obviously, it was minority industrialization. Everybody didn't benefit from the industrialization. But this time we have the opportunity, and as I said, for the first time, we have the private sector, both foreign and local, and an enthusiastic and more capable state at the moment. And at least that we share the vision of it must be an investment-driven growth path, not just financial speculation, not just based on commodity prices and so on, but actually on productive investment. So I think we are really, we've got the building blocks in place.
Okay. Jacques, Brenda, I'll come to you shortly. Jacques, I want to find out, when you're then looking at this infrastructure and these plans and this collaboration, how is it going to be, because one of the aims is that there's economic growth that benefits all South Africans, not perhaps people who are large players like we've spoken about.
Sure.
How is that going to practically happen?
So I'm going to exploit the example that Lionel gave earlier, because there's a dimension of it that he didn't have a chance to go into, which is the Swanny Automotive Special Economic Zone. Now, that's one of the largest build programs in South African history and one of the fastest. And in the context of that work, we've actually set aside 47% of the value of contracting for small players from the Mamelodi area. And we did it by doing three very important things. We embedded developmental supervision and dedicated proper enterprise supply development programs into the terms of reference. We created a community project committee that bypassed the usual 30% gangs and the other hustlers that claim to represent communities but actually represent narrow interests. So there was a broad base of community actors that were interested in being part of this thing. And then we had a way of verifying who was local that used, in that case we used a bit of technology. We verify based on the reverse geocoding, the address that you've registered as a director or as a company. And using those tools, we've been able to basically pump, now it's going to soon be hundreds of millions of rands of contracting through very small players that are able to benefit from the construction process. Now that's the build phase. The ops phase is more about how do you create black industrialist players. So one of the interesting things about the microgrid program that we mentioned earlier is Eskom's intention is not to treat this as another big company bonanza. The idea is to create black industrialists and broad-based players from the emerging sector that are the ones that drive this. And really, it's about how do you get proper value chain diversification and proper enterprise and supply development while preserving your need to be able to respond to scale. It's always going to be a balancing act, but you have to have those intentions built into the way infrastructure is procured and managed. That would be my answer there.
All right, so we've got two questions, I think, from the floor. If you can just let us know who you are, who your question's directed to. The gentleman with the mic in his hand.
Okay. I don't know if this is on.
Yes, it is on.
Thanks. My name's Chris Campbell. I am the CEO of Consulting Engineers South Africa. My question comes in, unfortunately, 3 parts. But I'm not going to make them long-winded, I promise you. Okay. I think when we listen to all of the hype, and this is wonderful stuff, it's like a fairy tale. And if it can come true, we are all the better for it. My challenge is in this whole just transition process, hydrogen, fuel cells, and if we look at using rail, which Lionel has actually already answered, it's not quite going to give you what you hope to get, because you've got such a serious backlog, legacy backlog in terms of the condition of the infrastructure. Yeah. But at the heart of all of this, and we're going to have the same conversation, we talk and we need to have this conversation, is transformation in that is, where are the skills? Where are the people that are going to make all of this happen? Because, and my question is anybody having this discussion with the Department of Basic Education? Because I've got stats over here, just very quickly. 2011 to 2019, average of 500,000 learners, 250,000 write maths in matric. Mm-hmm. Who'd like to guess how many actually get 70% and more? 10%. That's 25,000. And of those 25,000, they may go into the financial services sector, they become medical practitioners, and any other thing that may be science related. Why is this picture not changing? Because if it doesn't change, none of these things we're aspiring to are actually going to materialize. And we're going to constantly have the the argument that we need to use imported skills because we don't have the skills. So I think the conversation needs to be broadened so that we can address these problems systemically. A lot of companies and people are putting money into maths education and all of that, but it's like, are they checking what's the outcome? Or are they supporting lunacy?
Okay.
So that's just my question.
Is that the third
Done.
part? So quick.
I don't know. I think on the last part is, I'm very excited about the African Free Trade Agreement. I do think, though, that maybe we're a little bit short-sighted. We can fix all our infrastructure and send as many goods as we want to. But unless the economies north of our border are growing, and they too have the relevant infrastructure, it ain't going to happen. Maybe we should be doing more to export and assist them with some of our skills in the construction industry, so that you can have, functional infrastructure, not only where you're sending your goods from, but where you're sending it to.
Okay.
And we can assist the local practitioners. You know, in Africa has got enough engineers, they lack the skills. We've got them, we can help sort the problem out. And if you change the economic profile of people there, your demand for goods is a no-brainer.
All right. Did anybody like to respond to that before we move on to our next question?
No, I think the point is correct that is being made, and as I said, it's that lack of coordination, and you see that's why investment South Africa or infrastructure South Africa is so important. There's a big gap. As I said, skills is being done by the SIDSSA, and then you have these investment projects. So, for example, just to say, but I mean, as I said, it's still small scale if you take the country as a whole. But if you go now to Silverton, there's 10,000 people on site. 10,000 people, and as Jacques said, 45% has been given to SMMEs and black players into that. So you've seen a real one. Currently, obviously, the skills is being worked on because immediately 12 factories go into full production in February.
Yeah.
So we've had to, as I said, fast track that coordination between skills because they must employ, it's going to be 2,000 full-time jobs being added, and we're hitting that problem of coordination and so on. So you're right. All I'm saying is the good thing, and I know we've got a terrible past and so on, but as I said, you don't get success if you focus on the past. Going forward, and this is what Infrastructure South Africa does. It is now getting all the players into one room. It is getting the funders, it is getting the South African companies, it's getting foreign companies. We must coordinate that. And that's, as I said, that is really unique. Infrastructure South Africa is 1 year old. So all I'm saying is we have to be positive. There are pockets of excellence here. We just came back now as the Special Economic Zone, IDC unit. We come from Tubatsi in Limpopo, in Sekokuni land. There's two big smelters, Glencore doing chrome and Semencore. We went again, next to the plant is a facility run by Glencore, world-class training center, where they're providing people with skills there. Fitting and turning, basic engineering skills and so on, and it's happening there. We visited on site and so on. And they say they are fully supplied because everybody goes there to work at the Glencore plant and at the Semencore plant. And as you know, there's 21 platinum mines in Limpopo at the moment and so on. So there is a massive demand. So I think what we are going to be faced is that skills crunch. But then it gives us an opportunity because we've got lots of skilled people in this country who, as I said, have been dormant. But now demand is going to impact because, as you know, the commodity boom is back. And they're saying now, what Coleman was saying is that it's a secular turn. It's not just going to be a boom. So there is going to be demand for our minerals in this country. And so, which means the mining houses are going to be investing. But as you say, we then face the skills constraint. But as I said, we must then bring all our resources together.
To reinforce that, I think it's much easier to run a workforce development program if you've got the demand defined. Because I think a lot of the deficits that come up in our skilling system. And we've got to be frank about this. Nationally, as a system, we spend somewhere around 200 billion rand a year on post-secondary education of various kinds, and we don't get a great deal of return for it because we're too certification driven. We don't focus on the requirements of specific industrial sectors and get them to participate in the cost of educating. So you take the Glencore type model that Lionel's referencing, and you expand it to entire sectors that come together, similar to what India and various other countries have done. We can get very far very quickly, even if it's still going to take us a while to get through the kinks out of the basic education system, which is a lengthier set of problems. But there is the opportunity, especially on all this infrastructure stuff, to create bespoke skill sets. Part of Gauteng's partnership with Sasol, for example, is deliberately focusing on what do we need to do to bring the hydrogen economy skills online. Because you're going to need not only manufacturing for renewable energy, but a whole lot of stuff in balance of plant, installation of and maintenance of cables, installing and maintaining renewable energy devices, whether it's photovoltaics or wind farms. There's a lot of new kinds of opportunity. If we're going to be, deploying, and Sasol's going to be part of this, 240,000 hectares worth of developable, concessionable, renewable energy carrying land in the Northern Cape. That's a lot of personnel that need to be involved in that in directly there, and a whole lot more that need to be involved in the value chain that gets there, including here in Gauteng. So once you've got the demand, putting in place the workforce development program becomes both easier to fund and easier to manage. And I think that's part of what we have to see as our objective while we are justly keeping the foot on the accelerator with the education system.
All right, we're going to continue taking questions, but let's bring in Stuart Theobald now for an outsider perspective. He is joining us from London. Very good afternoon to you. Just talk to us about policy and perception and the importance of both when it comes to infrastructure in a South African context, my apologies, and just give us your understanding of where South Africa is now.
Look, South Africa is currently investing significantly less than it needs to be investing to be a high growth economy. And that's the problem that SIDSSA and Infrastructure South Africa is designed to address. So it really has to accelerate the levels of investment. I think from an outside perspective, we can appreciate a lot of the efforts being done by the public sector to mobilize resources to create institutions like the Infrastructure Fund to support infrastructure development. But the international perspective keeps coming back to where is the private sector investment itself. So we talk about some of the big projects that Lionel October has mentioned as very good examples of investment happening. But when you look at overall from a macro perspective, how much investment the private sector is doing, it's been flatlined since about since the financial crisis. There really hasn't been much growth there at all. And the question internationally is, well, what is the policy environment that would enable more private sector investment? And we see good examples like the amendments to the Electricity Regulation Act to allow private operators to invest in their own electricity generation capacity up to 100 megawatts. That's the kind of really positive reform that I think globally is recognized as the South African government saying, okay, we're going to take the brakes off the private sector. We're going to create policy that clears the road for the private sector to start to invest itself. And those kinds of opportunities are very important. The other one that has long been waited for by international investors looking at the South African macro environment is spectrum auctions. Now, we know that there's a very complicated process and litigation and sequencing of different policy steps that has to happen so that spectrum can be auctioned, and that would trigger a large flow of investment in the private sector into building the infrastructure to use that spectrum and take broadband to customers. So that's the missing part of the conversation that I think internationally investors want to see in South Africa, because it is the kind of conversation that we're seeing in lots of other developing markets in the rest of the world, where the focus is on enabling the private sector to invest rather than a conversation that's only about how the public sector can mobilize investment in public infrastructure. As important as that component is, the missing piece of the puzzle from a global perspective is where's the conversation on what we're going to do to stimulate private sector investment as well?
With you.
Thanks for that, Brenda. I want to bring you back into the conversation before we take another question from the floor. I want us to carry on looking forward. We understand more of the context of what's happening. We know also where Sasol is going in terms of hydrogen and all of that. You've said to government by 2030 you'll change your fuel specifications. In 2030, what kind of infrastructure and energy are we going to be seeing?
Yeah, so we're hoping that by 2030 we can already start to introduce sustainable products. So when I heard the president talk about it this morning, I was like, okay, so at least the lingo is now being shared. So by 2030 we hope, for example, Clean Fuels 2 will be fully implemented in the country, so that we now start to fuel our vehicles with a fuel that is now aligned with the Euro spec, right? So less carbon intensive. Second to that is also looking at fuels. We are also now trying to put in charging infrastructure. We see the mega trends as electrification is starting to come in, but now we need to look at what is going to be the source of the electricity. But it's more important to provide that infrastructure so that our customers can start to benefit from that. Beyond that, and we're looking at our own facilities, I think we also need to acknowledge is that the products that we produce today is not going to be exactly the same in 2030. As we start to introduce green hydrogen into our own facilities, we are going to start to see the emergence of SAF. We are going to see global airlines starting to fly into South Africa to be able to fuel up. Second to that, it's about now producing green chemicals, green ammonia, green methanol, starting to stimulate our steel industry and starting to supply into that sector as well. We also have an ambition when we think about the N3 corridor, so it's a very strong partnership that we've just signed up with Imperial, is to now start to power the trucks on the N1 with green hydrogen as well. So from an infrastructure perspective, this requires a lot of things to fall into place. One is we do need to upgrade our grid connectivity. All of this can only be possible if we can transfer electrons from areas with high wind capacity, such as in the Northern Cape, to our facilities in Qunta as well as in Sasolburg. So we need to upgrade that. Rail facility also needs to be upgraded, and here we're hoping that through the public and private partnership, we can work with the likes of Transnet to say, how can we co-fund? How do we look at this together as opposed in isolation, and what can we do to support? How do we provide you with offtake agreements such that it becomes a more attractive opportunity when we think about outside investors outside of South Africa? So when we think about products, we do see the product slate actually changing. We do see our customers now becoming a lot more selective. The customers are actually rejecting the products that we're producing. And let's think about Woolworths in a South African context, where all of a sudden when you stopped at Woolworths, it was no longer a plastic bag. And we are seeing that even from a Sasol perspective with the plastics that we're producing, customers are saying, no thank you, we now want alternatives. So for us to maintain our existence, that product slate has to change. But government has a key role to play in helping Sasol to achieve that objective from an infrastructure perspective as well as from incentives.
All right, let's get the second question from the floor. Checking whose hand was up and who needs that mic. Okay, perhaps there's no question. Okay, there's a question behind you.
Thank you very much. Nick Latter from the British High Commission in Pretoria. I'm struck that really impressively we've got a narrative here about how we're driving big wins and big infrastructure supported by big business. I wondered how you gave Jacques a great exposition about how small businesses have been supported in the Swanny automotive zone. But I wonder, very often infrastructure, and particularly, for example, electricity, it is an enabler for small businesses. How are you talking to and understanding the needs of small businesses in order to ensure that your infrastructure pipeline matches that in order to drive the job creation, particularly that small businesses are so good at?
Okay. Sure. So I think the first thing to note is, and we often use as a reference a very wonkish World Bank report that was published at the end of 2018 that focused on high growth firms and focused on how emerging markets in particular can harness high growth sectors. And one of its more interesting points of analysis, which might be obvious to some, but it's worth repeating, is that your large companies actually can't increase your rate of economic growth. They kind of keep you where you are. And they keep your rate of labor absorption where it is. So to use a really tedious metaphor, if the economy was a car, they kind of keep you going at 60 or 70 kilometers an hour. If you lose them, you go slower, but they can't increase you to 120. To do that, you need lots of firms in the first 5 to 10 years of their life cycle. So firstly, you can't do big economic growth without SMME participation. Certainly, the small to medium scale is necessary not just for job creation, but for growth period. Now, how you make sure that infrastructure supports them is to understand what the sectoral orientation that gives us the advantage from infrastructure looks like. So when you're looking at something like energy, which is a great example, we've got to recognize that the price of energy is one binding constraint. So you've got to be able to reduce the cost of energy. You've got to be able to make sure your availability factor is high enough to be reliable so that people don't resort to generators, which drives their costs through the roof and creates all kinds of disruption. And then now, as Brenda is mentioning, and as Lionel has mentioned, you've got to be able to go green. I think it's over 50% of our manufacturing base at all sizes is not exportable to your, well, one-time club membership, now your neighbor, the European Union, it won't be exportable after 2030. The carbon border adjustment tariffs will just make it completely uncompetitive for anything made with coal-based electricity to be sold in a whole range of overseas markets. Now, if that's a problem for the large players, it's even more of a problem for the small players that are eyeing out export scale. So the idea of creating, for example, the microgrid story and things like green H2 used as an energy vector to create green energy at an affordable price is not only a big industry play, it's also a play for the mid-sized people that are in the supply chains of those various sectors. Then in addition, you've got to look even lower down the economic kind of evolution, not evolution scale, but the capital formation scale. So if you look, for example, at township areas, where 9 out of 10 businesses don't even have a business bank account, aren't part of the regulatory net, to get their electricity potentially from a illegal connection to a street pole, for example. Even there, energy can be a real enabler of growth, because if you're introducing new kinds of microgrids there and affordable energy there, and you're creating township-based suppliers of those clusters that can create affordable energy for at or less than what people are paying the energy thieves to connect them up to the street pole, you're creating developmental conditions there as well. And that fits into a much bigger set of angles around what we're doing for township economy. In Gauteng, for example, we're establishing these new township enterprise zones where we bring all kinds of benefits and tax breaks, etc., to township areas. And part of it is looking at how we can integrate those areas through industrial diversification into the value chains of larger industries. And what we do with infrastructure is a very big part of that. So, for example, if we're looking at an area like the Vaal, Lionel's often described it as South Africa's Rust Belt. It was once upon a time an industrial heartland. The base load isn't there anymore, nearly as much as it should be, and all kinds of smaller and medium enterprises that could be suppliers into the value chains that could have come out of there are being stymied because of the conditions that are there. You bring in green energy as not only a basis for a basis of supply and industry and a new kind of industry that is based there, but also as basically a way to restore the base load of that area. You also benefit a whole range of smaller players in the value chain. So it's about how you do drive genuine transformation and diversification, and that's got to be deliberate. It doesn't happen organically. And it's got to be recognizing that the economy is such an interlinked reality that what you do with the big players does affect what happens to the smaller guys, provided that you have made sure that in the context of those value chains, there is room for small players. And that, as a final point, is one of the things government can do by virtue of the value that we are creating through spaces like Infrastructure South Africa. If we are putting value creation on the table, it gives us the leverage to be able to say, we want these kinds of inclusive and developmental outcomes. And that's another not often spoken of byproduct of the kind of thing we're doing here at SIDS and under Infrastructure South Africa.
All right, I want to go back to Stuart. We brought him quite late into the conversation, and also if you've got a question, please just raise your hand and a roving mic will come to you. Stuart, your company did a report, Infrastructure for South Africa report, recommending, among other things, reforms in energy, mining, spectrum availability to boost private sector investment which can be achieved at no cost to the public purse. A lot of the time that we've spent today has also been dedicated to recovery, economic recovery, the economic reconstruction and recovery plan in light of COVID. And what we haven't spoken about so much is the riots and the chaos in South Africa in July. You've said, despite that, there is still an investment case for South Africa. Why?
Look, you find that investment in infrastructure in the private sector happens when capacity utilization is high. So when factories are producing the most that they can with their existing infrastructure and they believe there's going to be more demand, they build to expand capacity. Now, South Africa, and because of both COVID and because of the riots, saw a substantial decline in capacity utilization as well as a decline in demand. So the incentives to drive private sector investment in infrastructure are currently very low on their own merits. So what can we do from a public policy point of view to change that equation? The only answer is to use policy levers to create space for the private sector to invest in new infrastructure. Now, you mentioned spectrum, you mentioned electricity. Mining is an interesting one because if you look at the breakdown of private sector investment, my investment in exploration in mining has basically collapsed for the last 10 years. It's been very little. And we know from conversations with miners that that's really driven by considerable uncertainty over the policy outlook for the mining sector. Now, this is a real problem. Mining is still a big part of the South African economy, big part of our export earnings, very important to the economy. And mines all have a finite lifespan. So exploration is really about building the pipeline of a future industry because existing mines are going to run out and you need to make sure that the pipeline is there to replace it. So we should be very concerned that there is no exploration investment happening in mining in South Africa at the moment, almost none. Now, the way that this can be addressed is to address the problems that investors are telling us are there. There's considerable uncertainty about policy. Now, there's been litigation, and we recently had court findings about the mining charter, but there's been an MPRDA amendment bill, there's a gas sector bill, and so on. All of these are uncertainties that currently constrain, and that from a policy perspective, if they were fixed, you would immediately open up a new pipeline of investment that could be happening into infrastructure, into gross fixed capital formation. And that's just one sector that's really important to the economy. And if we don't start doing something about that soon, we're going to see cliff edges as mines' existing lives reach their end. And that has knock-on effects for the rest of the economy as supply chains start to break down with raw materials entering those supply chains. So that's just one important example. And we talked about electricity, spectrum, those are others.
Mm. Lionel, from where you're sitting, where are the gaps and what does South Africa need to do for more of those big infrastructure wins?
Yeah, so as I indicated, we slowly, I think with the new Minister of Finance, or not so new anymore, I think he started the ground on a very good note, you know, because he immediately at least gave some comfort, you know, that we're addressing our 11-year-old problem of electricity. You know, load shedding started in 2008 or something, you know. And so he showed at least the policy intent to deal with that problem. Then he is also, obviously, the digital migration problem, the spectrum, release of the spectrum. I think both the president and the minister has now indicated that's a top priority. So I think, as I said, those are important signals because those are big sectors. Telecommunications, electricity is big. So I think we're getting there, but I think it obviously needs to be followed through by the ministers in practice to roll out the spectrum now. We've solved the electricity part of the problem. And then, as I say, we do have an advantage as a country, and these are our strengths. Like we've got our Anglo-Americans, we've got Sasol, global giants, and also many of our foreign investors, like your Mercedes-Benz. I mean, Ford has been in the country for almost 100 years. They're celebrating their 100th anniversary in 2 years' time. So we've got them in the country. As I said, they were here before, but they excluded 90% of the population from the benefits of those investments. But I think we must now put the past behind us. We are now together, at least on the same page, working together. And I think we're at a wonderful moment in the country now, with the first a president which is really driving, he's putting the economy front and center of his agenda. There's no more any other issues. There's only investment. Is at top of his agenda infrastructure investment and private investment. As you know, we've got a private sector investment conference coming up next month. We have our annual investor one. So now we're getting the two together. And as he indicated, we're currently at 14%, which is half of our target. 14% of GDP is going into investment, and 70% of that comes from the private sector. So I agree absolutely with Stuart. The big driver is the private sector. They bring in 70%. But I'm saying all the ones are aligning now with domestic investors. You've got Anglo-American big sponsors of this conference, Sasol, which are our old industrial national champions. You've got the global, you've got both Toyota and Ford are starting electric vehicle production in the country. Ford has closed down in India and in Brazil, and they're expanding in South Africa. So whilst there's a lot of, as I said, people like to harp on the negativity, but there are real green shoots, which is not in theory, as I said, it's in practice. And I think we are there now with even this conference is acknowledgement for it and so on. So I think it's now just to institutionalize it. And as I said, our model for special economic zone, have come up with a model now. We've got, as I said, for the special economic zones to have 3 board members on that from the private sector. It's the first time in government. So I think we must just roll out that model. We're rolling out the model in the green energy space. We must obviously replicate that model now throughout. That this is this sort of, it's driven by a chariot, you know, and it's 2 horses. It's government and the private sector. You have to move together. Otherwise this chariot can't be pulled. And I think we're getting there.
Okay, just like to find out if there's any more questions from the floor, any more comments from the floor. Stuart, if I can bring you back into the conversation just to respond to what's been said now.
The potential here around the green economy, I think, is hugely exciting. There's the hydrogen economy that Sasol has made important announcements about. But just broadly, we need to create thousands of megawatts of energy production in the green economy. And that has the potential to really drive a wider industrialization agenda and localization and policies that DTIC is advancing. But I think we need to learn some lessons from the past. So we know that the REAP program, for example, was very successful in its first 4 rounds in building up capacity in industrial supply chains, for instance, domestic assembly plants for PV panels and domestic assembly of wind turbine towers. But we then hit a roadblock in the REAP program where subsequent rounds were hit by all kinds of delays. And we saw those businesses effectively fall over. And I think it's important to emphasize the timing and sequencing of policy and capacity in the private sector has to be done right. So it's not going to help us to have massive demand hit the marketplace for local production when there's no local production capable of meeting that demand. It's got to be sequenced appropriately, and we need a long time horizon to be able to see out for the private sector to make the commitment to invest in expanding capacity to be able to meet future demand. So I think it's just a note to pick up on Lionel's comment there, and the importance, of course, about how this can drive a sector from a macro perspective. I think the big wins, Ford's investments and so on, are really great accolades to the country. But when we think about a macro perspective, it's not about large deals. It's about many small deals happening throughout an economy. And we need to create the right incentive environment for everybody, businesses small and big, to have the confidence to invest in expanding output by putting the infrastructure, the plants really building to be able to meet expanded output to take advantage of some of these opportunities. So just a comment around that industrialization potential that we really have.
There's a sense from some of the comments that I've picked up is that although people are interested and want good stories, there's a concern about being too ethereal around issues of infrastructure, which are very practical.
Sure.
But going forward, how do we implement the NIP 2050? How do we get there without some of the warm and fuzzy feelings that we've spoken about in this panel?
Sure, and no, it's entirely fair for people to say, South African government, you are you are masters at headlines and documents and et cetera, but you struggle with the practicalities. And I think at one level, Infrastructure South Africa is a direct rebuke to that, in the sense that it converges a whole lot of capabilities in the public sector. It then has also drawn in significant capability from the private sector to add to the discipline. I think also that the fact that private sector finance is such a huge part of the implementation pathway for all these strategic integrated projects creates a level of discipline. It means that you can't just go in there with a kind of warm, fuzzy PowerPoint and kind of just high-flown aspirations and no detail. The process will throw you out very quickly, and you will find yourself sent back to kind of do more homework and really bring something more effective to the table. Recognizing that part of the reason that you don't get that detail is the level of capability when it comes to project preparation. That's also something that Infrastructure South Africa has started bringing additional capacity in with respect to the state, and is actually positioning people in the provinces to be able to work on those projects. I think that we've also got to recognize that the practicality of implementation is also about building different kinds of execution vehicles that are not based on the conventional government way of procuring and doing things, because that takes forever. I mean, Stuart's being very polite in this panel, but he's published some very eviscerating comments on the way we do public-private partnerships, and he's basically told us that we've completely over-bureaucratized the issue. Stu, you can violently correct me if I misquote you there. But effectively, right now, a public-private partnership is going to take you the better part of a decade, using conventional South African methodologies and rules as promulgated by Treasury. However, what this conference is showing, what the partnership with Sasol is showing, what the Special Economic Zone Network is showing, is that there are different ways that we can integrate the private sector into the delivery mechanism. And we've also got to recognize that part of it is also us as government putting some of the fundamentals in place that change the cost of doing business. I mean, one of the interesting facts from the Gauteng Eastern Cape corridor that Lionel and I know all too well, the cost of producing a Ford Ranger is almost directly equivalent in South Africa and Thailand, which is our major competitor for the manufacturing space. The difference in the cost of doing business to Ford is the cost of logistics. So if we don't put the logistics systems in place, we aren't competitive. If we do, we are, even with one of the strongest emerging manufacturing value propositions in Asia. So there is practical value in South Africa, but we've got to unlock it by making sure the right government systems are in place, where the public sector is the big spender, and making sure that where the private sector does join with us, they do so in a way that keeps their discipline alongside our developmental objectives. And that's the dance that Infrastructure South Africa has really started to choreograph, and I would argue effectively so.
Mm-hmm. Brenda, one of the issues that's been raised when it comes to public-private partnerships is the importance of them in this recovery that we're speaking about and moving forward. When it comes to the challenges that we also discussed today, such as unemployment in the South African economy and low growth, as a private company, what impetus do you have to try and ensure that where you are going, you are creating as many jobs as possible? Or if you're working with government, is it more their issue and you're just there to get things done?
No, absolutely not. So we've just had our Capital Markets Day, and one of the things that we're emphasizing is that as a private sector, it's our responsibility and our accountability to promote job creation, to promote localization, and to drive education. So when one of the questions was asked, we are now going to increase the amount that we're spending in bursaries, various collaborations with universities as well, because we see skills development as being a significant enabler for our green hydrogen ambition going forward. So we are not saying this is government's job, this is something we're taking on, but where we want to partner with government on it is to help us with ideas. Because I think really by putting the two partners together, we'll come up with better ideas than doing it on our own. So we're going to come up with the funding, we're going to put it into place, and make sure we see the fruits of that as well.
All right, I just want to go back to a government infrastructure. Talk to us, if you can, about South Africa's strategic gas pipeline corridors and how they play a role in the National Infrastructure Program 2050. Either Stuart or Lionel, if they can. It was meant for Minister Creecy, but she's not here. South Africa's strategic gas pipeline corridors, how they play a role in the National Infrastructure Program 2050.
do you want to go? Okay, so we are seeing gas as being a significant transitional feedstock. I mean, we all know that green hydrogen today is not affordable, right? And we are waiting with anticipation for technology to advance for it to become a lot cheaper. And renewables here is going to play a huge role in also making green hydrogen more affordable. But we can't sit back and wait for a decade for that to happen. So in what we're saying is up until 2030, we have to see gas as playing a significant transitional role. And hence, as part of that national development plan, we have to look at gas as to how do we mobilize gas. We can look at gas in South Africa out of Richards Bay, and here we are working with Transnet to see how do we look at enabling infrastructure in Richards Bay to unlock that potential. Similarly, we're working with the Mozambican government as well to say, what can we do to enable more gas into the region? Because ultimately, we need to look at the region broader and see gas as an energy source rather than as a feedstock for Sasol. So here we're saying to the region is that for the people of South Africa, we have to move away from coal over time, understanding that there's an impact on the just transition. But how do we move away to a more sustainable source being gas, and then thereafter transitioning to green hydrogen and pursuing carbon capture and storage thereafter?
All right, we are going to wrap up this panel shortly. Can I find out if there's any more questions from the floor, any comments that anybody would like to pose? If we can please get the roving mic back.
Okay. Thanks for giving me another bite of the cherry. I just wanted to clarify something. In case I came across as being negative or looking backward, I was actually encouraging us to look forward, because what we keep talking about university and all of those things, and if I look at the mining industry, the lack of investment because of the limitations on exploration, that's going to become more mechanized. Mines are not competitive if they don't use technology, right? That's going to have a massive impact on the people who will be employed there. We need to get those people into a different space. So I'm not talking about, I'm talking about short, medium, and long term. Because certainly if we start talking about 2050 aspirations, then all of you should be worried and be beating down the door of the Department of Basic Education. We've got to do something. With 2 years of COVID, how many kids have been affected adversely and have been set back in their schooling that may be able to participate in the skills development and the bursaries that you're going to make available? Very few. And so I think, I'm not trying to sound negative, I'm trying to say, look, we need to look at this systemically. I know it's a long-term problem, it's a long-term issue, but if we do nothing about it, then there ain't a whole lot that's going to change, because when you get to hydrogen fuel cells and refilling, that should have been automated a long time ago. We still have people filling, putting fuel in for us, because our economy and the people and the skills base, legacy related, is what's caused that. We need to look into the future and get people like that out of that, and get them into the real economy. And that's really what I'm saying here.
Yeah, I think it's good to have robust engagement and ask difficult questions, because it's good to have good platforms and good ideas, but if they aren't questioned and played with enough, then it's not good enough. We are towards the end of our panel. I'd like to ask everybody for closing remarks. Stuart, perhaps I'll start with you.
On Jack's provocation around PPPs. And I think he makes a good point that there are lots of different ways the private sector can be involved in the infrastructure story. SEZs, other kinds of concessions and so on are important. But I think Lionel mentioned earlier that at least a third of the capital investment we need is going to have to come from the private sector. And part of the big 5 wins, one of those is the idea of blended finance and tapping ESG investment appetite in the market. And I just want to conclude with some thoughts on that. What do we mean by blended finance? I actually find that term unhelpful. I'd rather think of things as blended risk allocation. Finance is just about taking a risk. I'm going to put my capital into somebody else's hands and hope that I'm going to earn an adequate return. So I'm going to take the risk of some loss. But when we look at good projects that bring together the public sector and different private sector actors, it's about allocating the appropriate risks to each one. It's appropriate to allocate financial risk to the private sector when it can control the financial risks that are exposed to that project. So examples are where there's a user pay structure that depends on how the project is shaped. A transport infrastructure, for instance, really depends on how you market, the accessibility of that infrastructure, etc., to customers. So the private sector has some control over the financial risk that it faces. But there are other kinds of risks, such as the default of the public sector in paying for the use of access to infrastructure. So an example of that was the IPP program, where a national treasury guarantee came in to limit the default risk that the private sector faced. And that to me is an example of blending risk allocation together. And that's what a PPP should really aim to achieve. I mean, a partnership like some of the projects in the IPP program, which are not technically PPPs in the official National Treasury sense, but are definitely public-private partnerships of a sort. What made them work was effective risk allocation. Who took the risk of default from the single payer? Who took the risk of the wind not blowing or the sun not shining? Who took the risk of the financial returns and potential risks around that? They were allocated appropriately. And that's what PPPs are important for. Now, Jack was absolutely right in that PPP bureaucracy is a real problem. It takes far too long to register and process a PPP in the South African context at the moment. But I know National Treasury are working hard on fixing that. And ultimately, I don't see an alternative. We need to get that right if we are going to maximize the value of projects by ensuring that we're doing risk allocation appropriately, because risks need to go to the party that is most able to manage and bear those risks. And that's how you reduce the cost of projects. If parties are unable to bear risks, they just increase the costs in order to cover themselves for those risks. And we'd rather get it right. So I think PPPs need to remain an important part of the answer. We need to drive for the kind of policy reform that will make PPPs highly effective in bringing the private sector and public sector together in the right risk frameworks to be able to deliver on the infrastructure challenge. So I'll leave it with that concluding thought.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Theobald, perhaps we can just move down this way.
Down the line, thanks. I think my concluding point, we were, over lunch, we just were dealing with some of the other panelists from, for example, the infrastructure financing panel just a few rooms down from us. And the figures that were being discussed, if you combine all the different categories of assets under management by various South African pension funds, et cetera, just domestically, you've got something like 16 trillion rand of assets available for mobilization. It's a huge potential pool that's sitting there, and in a lot of cases there's this unuseful construct where government calls the private sector names and says they're on an investor strike, and the private sector uses their grotesque kind of stereotype of government and says we're an inefficient bureaucracy that doesn't know how to actually enable investment. And while there's a grain of truth to each of those claims, it's not actually the reality. The reality is a lot more nuanced. And part of what is clear is that we can find each other in the private government, and I like Stuart's formulation. It is a blended risk-sharing model that we're taking to using infrastructure as a spur to growth. And if we can look at areas where we know we're both going to unlock export value, such as our SEZ, such as hydrogen, as well as unlock the economic participation of our citizenry at a mass scale. So one of the areas we didn't have a chance to dive into much here today was an area like broadband, where we, counting alone, we know that there's 50,000 digital economy jobs and 50,000 customer service jobs delivered digitally over the next 2-3 years that we could unlock in our most disadvantaged areas if we had proper broadband access going into those areas to enable connectivity. Those kind of scalers suit the private sector, suit government. It's an area of common cause. We just have to correctly identify them, correctly identify the revenue streams, structure the appropriate financing mechanisms, and as Brenda and Lionel are saying, and Stuart is saying actually, put together the right kind of deal structure that brings them together. If you've got the right kind of deal makers in the right rooms, you can do that. And I think what this summit and the structure behind it is doing is putting those deal makers in the right rooms. And we've got to continue doing that, not just today and in the summit, but as the day-to-day work of both the private sector and government.
Thank you.
Just a concluding comment, you said what's the next steps now and how do we just sort of tie up that gap? change our business model, and things has to change. So, for example, on our rail corridor project, if we're going to run a railway line now from Swanny to Gqeberha, 1,600 kilometers, you can't expect the private sector then just to passively give the money. They're going to have to also be part of operating the rail. Because as I said, the biggest risk sits, we as the state, we must de-risk. So as I said, in Tshwane, government has put in 2 billion rand, but private sector funding is 24 billion. 16 from Ford and 8 from the component manufacturers. So you can see government's 2 billion is key because it provides the basic infrastructure, but the 24 billion, now if we're going to get our rail network working, we have to follow through on the president's message that we have to cement this relationship, which means we have to change the business model. We can't stop. We're going to have to allow the private sector to also operate infrastructure. I think that's going to be, to fully get them on board, they're going to have to see the revenue streams. They're going to have to be able to control and ensure that it's not just a state-run entity, and then they have to wait and hope and pray that it's going to be successful. They have to be part of it.
It's also a mindset change, right? Because previously the private sector went ahead and delivered on its own strategic ambition. But if each one of us as the private sector really adopted a partnership approach, looked at SA Inc. as the bigger picture, and tried to understand what do each one of us bring to this, I think we will see a lot more acceleration in pace of delivery. But it's also the blended risk, and I like that idea about blended risk, because it's understanding who's carrying how much of risk, and also readjusting our appetite for returns. If we're going to go at this with a profit-making eye, of course, as Andre says yesterday, everything has to be feasible and everything has to make economic sense. But do we have to target a 20% return, or can we mute our returns to kind of say, for the better of South Africa, let's stabilize, let's develop, and then reset this country at a new pace. So we're very excited. We've tried this as the first pilot, and we're really excited to now pursue further partnerships with the public entities.
Thank you very much all for your time and insight, and thank you to our audience for your questions as well. I'd like to please remind everybody that the closing comments and farewell tea by the Minister and the Presidency, Mondli Gungubere, is going to be taking place in the plenary where we were earlier on. Please may we make our way there in the next 10 or 15 minutes for the closing ceremony. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you. I plagiarized the President.